My name is Richard Hayes. I am 52 years old, and I can still remember that night with a clarity that almost hurts, because some moments do not fade with time. They sharpen, they replay themselves in your mind when you least expect it, and that evening was one of them, the kind that splits your life into a before and an after without asking your permission, because I had pulled into my driveway just like I had thousands of times before, my shoulders heavy from another long day at the office, my tie loosened, my back stiff, my head full of numbers, emails, unfinished conversations, and quiet responsibilities that no one ever applauds. All I wanted was to step inside my house, kick off my shoes, maybe sit on the couch for a few minutes in silence. But before I even turned off the engine, my phone buzzed in my hand, and I looked down without thinking, expecting something ordinary, maybe a reminder, maybe nothing important at all, and instead I saw those 5 words staring back at me. Cold and simple and cruel in their simplicity, "Don't come home tonight." And for a second I honestly thought I had misread it, so I blinked and read it again slowly, letting each word settle, and I felt that familiar drop in the chest, that sinking feeling that tells you something is wrong even before your brain catches up. But strangely, instead of panic, instead of anger, something else took over, something quieter and sharper, because I didn't shout, I didn't call her name, I didn't jump out of the car or bang on the door. I just sat there with the engine still running, the soft vibration coming up through the seat, the headlights lighting up the garage door like nothing had changed, while everything inside me had shifted, because my wife had always been a strong woman, sharp, confident, sometimes distant, sometimes cold in a way I used to excuse as stress or ambition. But this message was different. This was not emotional. It was calculated, deliberate, like a door being closed slowly and intentionally, and I knew right then that she wasn't pushing me away in a moment of anger, she was removing me. And that realization hit harder than the message itself, because it forced me to look back at the last few months through a different lens, the late nights she brushed off, the phone calls she took in other rooms, the small financial decisions she insisted on handling herself, the way she spoke to me lately like I was an inconvenience instead of a partner, and sitting there in the driveway, I realized how many things I had ignored because it was easier to believe in peace than to face the truth. And yet even with that realization, I didn't feel out of control. I felt focused, like something in me finally snapped into alignment, because I had spent my entire adult life solving problems calmly, building systems, planning for worst cases that hopefully never came. And this was no different, not really, except this time the problem was personal, deeply personal, and instead of reacting, I found myself breathing slowly, reading the message again, then locking my phone, setting it face down on the seat beside me, and staring at the house I thought I knew, the house I paid for, the house I believed was my safe place, now suddenly feeling like a stage where a play had been going on without my knowledge. And that's when something small but important surfaced in my mind, a memory I had dismissed weeks ago, an email I had received late one night while reviewing documents, something about property records and account authorizations, something I had flagged and saved without really understanding why at the time, because when you live long enough, you learn to trust your instincts even when you can't explain them. And right there, sitting alone in the dark with my wife's message echoing in my head, I remembered that email clearly. I remembered the language, the timing, the subtle warning hidden inside what looked like routine paperwork. And I unlocked my phone again, scrolled through my inbox, found it, and read it twice, slowly, carefully, like a man rereading a map when he realizes he's been walking in the wrong direction. And as I read it, the pieces began to connect in a way that made my stomach tighten but my mind grow calm. Because suddenly the message telling me not to come home wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the confirmation of something that had already been set in motion, something my wife thought she was controlling, something she believed I would never notice until it was too late. And instead of fear, I felt clarity, because I understood in that moment that I wasn't trapped, I wasn't powerless, and I wasn't reacting blindly. I was standing at a crossroads where every quiet decision I had made, every document I had read carefully, every precaution I had taken without fully knowing why, was about to matter. And as I sat there, alone in my driveway, the house dark, the neighborhood silent, I realized that this was the night my life changed, not because she sent a message, but because I chose not to answer it the way she expected, because I chose calm over chaos, patience over panic, and planning over pleading. And that choice, made in silence with my hands resting on the steering wheel and my phone lying face down beside me, would set everything else into motion in ways she never saw coming. I sat there in the car for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold and bitter in the cup holder, and I stared out at the driveway, at the familiar curve of the walkway, the shadows stretching across the garage, the quiet street beyond, and for a moment I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, the exhaustion of decades of work, the stress of maintaining a life that suddenly felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and yet I was completely alert, completely aware, because in that silence, in the stillness, everything became clear. She had locked the door behind her, had turned off her phone, probably believing she had trapped me, believing that this text, those 5 words, would set me into panic, fear, anger, confusion, something she could control, and I could almost hear the smirk she must have had as she walked out, thinking I was oblivious, thinking she had the upper hand, but she didn't. Realized that I had been paying attention for months, quietly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, and that quiet observation had allowed me to notice the small, seemingly insignificant things she did, the way she glanced at her phone when she thought I wasn't watching, the unusual late-night calls, the hidden financial slips, the hints that money had been moved or accounts changed without my knowledge, the sudden insistence on documents being signed that she hadn't explained fully, all of it. Scattered like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to complete until now, and as I held the mug, feeling the cold ceramic against my palms, I realized that these small actions, which I had dismissed at the time as quirks, as minor mistakes, or as the eccentricities of someone I trusted, were actually part of a pattern, a web she had been weaving for months, maybe years, thinking I wouldn't see, and that's when I made the call. I called my old lawyer, someone who had been with me through countless business dealings, someone I trusted implicitly, someone who understood not just the mechanics of finance and property but also the subtle maneuvers people made when they thought no one was paying attention, and I explained everything with precision, every observation, every suspicion, every small detail I had quietly collected, speaking calmly, deliberately, no drama, no accusations, no rising panic in my voice, just a careful presentation of facts, facts that she had assumed I either didn't know or wouldn't act upon, and as I spoke, as I laid everything out, I felt the plan take shape in my mind, each step folding neatly into the next, each move calculated, strategic, unhurried, because I had the time and the clarity to think, something she would never expect in a man she assumed would crumble, and I could see the pieces on the board in my imagination, the accounts she had thought were untouchable, the property she had assumed was fully under her control, the custody arrangements she thought I would never contest, all quietly shifting, slowly, invisibly, exactly as I had prepared for over the last year without her knowing, and it was almost poetic, almost beautiful in the way it came together, the quiet power of preparation meeting the arrogance of someone who underestimated me, and I sat back, taking a slow sip of the coffee that tasted of nothing but focus now, and I felt the calm settle over me, a stillness deeper than any fear, stronger than any anger. Because I knew I had the advantage, I had the foresight, I had the patience, and the most important thing I had learned in 52 years was that the quietest men often held the sharpest knives, not the kind that cut flesh, but the kind that cut through deception, manipulation, lies, and false confidence. And in that driveway, under the dim glow of the streetlights, with the house silent behind me, I realized that all of her moves, her tricks, her small manipulations, would meet their match. Not in confrontation or shouting but in the cold, deliberate, patient execution of a plan that had been building quietly, invisibly, for months, and the knowledge of that power, the awareness of the inevitability of what was coming, brought with it a sense of clarity and control I had never felt before, because I understood something that she never would, that the mind is the greatest weapon, and when it is calm, focused, and prepared, no amount of manipulation, no amount of betrayal, no amount of deceit can stand against it. And as I sat there, watching the shadows stretch across the driveway, feeling the night settle around me, I knew that the storm she thought she had brought upon me was already beneath my control, that every move she imagined would catch me off guard had already been anticipated, and in that stillness, in that quiet, I tasted the subtle thrill of power, of readiness, of knowing that the next chapter of our lives would unfold not with chaos and shouting, but with precision, with inevitability, with the cold satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. And as I finally set the mug down and rested my hands on the steering wheel, I felt the calm wash over me completely, and I understood for the first time in years that patience and observation, quiet and deliberate, were far more powerful than anger and reaction. And in that calm before the storm, with the house locked, the phone off, the night silent, I realized that I was ready to turn the tables in ways she could never imagine, to take control without her knowing it until it was too late. And that thought, that certainty, made me almost smile, because in all my 52 years, I had never felt such complete awareness, such complete preparation, such complete quiet power flowing through me, and I knew that nothing she did from this point forward could unsettle me, because I had already pieced together the entire picture. I had already prepared the moves that would change everything, and in that quiet driveway, I understood for the first time what true calm before the storm really meant. Not panic, not chaos, not reaction, but the patient, deliberate, unstoppable knowledge that I held every card, and that every step she thought would trap me had already been anticipated and countered, and in that understanding, I found not just readiness, but a quiet, undeniable sense of control, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely unshakable, completely aware, completely ready, because the storm was coming, yes, but I had already built the shelter, I had already drawn the map, I had already counted every move, and when the morning came, when the world awoke and she finally saw what had been done, she would understand, too late, that she had never stood a chance against patience, planning, and the quiet power of a man who refused to be caught off guard, and that realization, cold and sharp and precise, settled over me like a cloak, as I sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, coffee long gone cold, watching the dark shadows and waiting, calm and patient, for the moment the storm would begin, and in that quiet, alone in the car with only my thoughts, I understood more deeply than ever before that true strength is often invisible, and in that invisibility lies an unstoppable force that no one, not even those closest to you, can anticipate. And as the minutes ticked by in perfect silence, I felt the full weight and clarity of it, and I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that everything was about to change, and it would change on my terms, quietly, decisively, and without a single word spoken aloud. Looking back now, with the clarity that only distance and pain can give you, I can see that the signs were everywhere, scattered through my life like warning lights I chose to dim instead of confront, because it was easier to believe in stability than to accept that the ground beneath me was slowly cracking, and for years I told myself that what I was noticing were misunderstandings, coincidences, moments taken out of context, or worse, flaws in myself, because blaming myself felt safer than questioning the person I had built my life around. And it started small, so small that anyone could have missed it, a bank statement that didn't quite line up, an account I didn't recognize that she brushed off as old or temporary, a late-night phone call she stepped outside to take, her voice lowered, her back turned to me like a physical barrier, and when I asked, she always had an answer ready, smooth and reasonable, and I wanted so badly to believe her that I accepted those answers without digging deeper, because that's what I thought marriage was, trusting even when something didn't sit right, enduring discomfort for the sake of peace, choosing patience over confrontation, and I convinced myself that love meant compromise, that commitment meant swallowing doubts, that loyalty meant silence when questions threatened to disrupt the image of a stable life, and over time, those small moments became patterns, the whispers she cut short when I entered the room, the plans she discussed with others but never fully shared with me, the way she began to talk about the future as if I was a background character rather than a partner, and yet every time my instincts nudged me to look closer, I pushed them aside, telling myself I was tired, stressed, overthinking, because the alternative, the idea that the woman I trusted was slowly building a separate life, one that did not include me except as a resource or an obstacle, felt too heavy to face, and so I endured, year after year. Believing that endurance itself was a virtue, believing that if I just stayed steady, stayed kind, stayed quiet, things would balance out, but sitting there in the driveway that night, with her message still echoing in my mind and the house locked against me, something finally broke through that fog, and I saw the truth with brutal clarity, not as a collection of isolated moments but as a complete picture, a life within a life that she had carefully constructed while I played the role of provider, stabilizer, and fallback plan, and suddenly every gift she had given me felt different, every affectionate gesture felt staged, every surprise felt less like love and more like a distraction designed to keep me occupied while she moved pieces behind the scenes, because she didn't just want independence, she wanted control, control over finances, over assets, over narratives, over the future, and without realizing it, I had handed her the tools by trusting blindly, by assuming good intentions where strategy lived, and that realization didn't hit me like a wave of rage the way people expect betrayal to feel. Instead it settled into me slowly, painfully, like a deep ache mixed with an unexpected sense of clarity, because alongside the sadness, the grief for the marriage I thought I had, there was understanding, a sharp, undeniable understanding that I had not been foolish so much as hopeful, that I had chosen peace over vigilance, and that choice, while human, had a cost. And yet even as that cost became clear, I felt something else rise within me, something steady and grounded, because I knew in that moment that I would not play the role she had written for me, the role of the confused, emotional man scrambling to understand what went wrong while she positioned herself as the one in control. I would not beg for explanations, I would not lash out in ways that exposed my hand, and I would not allow myself to be reduced to a victim of circumstances I could now clearly see, because the trust had been broken. Yes, the lies had been told, the manipulation carefully layered over time, but none of that meant I was powerless, and as I replayed every ignored sign in my mind, not with regret but with analysis, I began to understand how predictable her moves had been, how consistent her behavior was once you stripped away the excuses I had given her, and it felt like watching a chessboard from above, recognizing patterns, anticipating strategies, seeing how each move led to the next, and in that awareness, I felt calm settle deeper into my bones, because anger clouds judgment, but clarity sharpens it, and I was no longer reacting emotionally, I was observing, calculating, preparing, understanding that the best response to manipulation is not confrontation but foresight, not noise but precision, and I realized that she believed she was steps ahead of me, that she had mistaken my silence for ignorance, my patience for weakness, my trust for blindness, and that mistake was the very thing that would undo her plans, because while she was busy constructing a version of the future where I was sidelined, I had been quietly building safeguards, contingencies, records, connections, not out of suspicion at first, but out of habit, the habit of a man who plans for uncertainty even when he hopes it never arrives, and sitting there, reflecting on everything I had ignored for too long, I understood that betrayal is rarely sudden, it is gradual, incremental, disguised as normalcy, and it succeeds only when the betrayed refuses to see. But that night, I finally saw, and with that sight came resolve, a quiet, unshakable resolve that I would not be caught unprepared, that I would not be cornered emotionally or financially, that I would respond not with chaos but with structure. And as the weight of the past settled into place, I felt a strange sense of balance return, because while I mourned the trust that had been lost, I also recognized the strength that had been forged through endurance, the discipline that had come from years of responsibility, the clarity that now allowed me to see the board in its entirety, and I knew, without doubt, that I was ready, not for a fight fueled by anger, but for a conclusion shaped by intention, because I wasn't angry in the way people expect. I wasn't shaking, shouting, or unraveling. I was calm, deliberate, and fully prepared, aware that the most effective responses are often invisible until they are complete. And as I sat there, replaying the years I had misunderstood, the signs I had ignored, the trust one had given freely, I made a decision that would define everything that followed, a decision to step out of denial and into control, to stop enduring silently and start acting intentionally, because while endurance may sustain a marriage, ignorance destroys the self, and I was done sacrificing myself to maintain an illusion, and in that quiet moment of reckoning, with the truth fully in view and my emotions finally aligned with reality, I felt the certainty of a man who knows the next moves before they are played, the certainty of someone who understands that checkmate is not about aggression but about positioning, patience, and timing. And trust me when I say this, that night, sitting alone with the full weight of betrayal finally acknowledged, I wasn't falling apart, I was coming together. And for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly where the game was heading and exactly how it would end. I didn't storm into the house that night, didn't slam doors, didn't raise my voice or demand explanations, because I understood something she never did, that noise gives away intention and calm conceals it, and while she believed she had created distance and confusion, I was already moving with quiet purpose, executing a sequence of decisions that had been forming long before she ever sent that message, because preparation does not begin at the moment of crisis, it begins when instinct whispers that something is off and you listen without announcing it, and the first move, the one she would never expect, involved the property we had shared for decades, the house she thought of as leverage, as insurance, as something she could hold over me if things ever turned sour, not realizing that weeks earlier, in an ordinary office with ordinary lighting in a stack of documents that looked painfully boring to anyone not paying attention, I had signed papers that shifted ownership in a way that was strategic, legal, and irreversible, designed not to punish but to protect, structured carefully to secure my family's future and prevent exactly the kind of maneuvering she believed she was entitled to. And there was no drama in that moment, no sense of revenge, just the steady understanding that assets are safest when they are shielded quietly rather than fought over loudly. And once that was in place, once the foundation had been secured beneath her feet without her noticing the ground had changed, I moved on to the accounts, the shared finances she had grown comfortable treating as her personal playground, moving money through channels she assumed I didn't monitor, forgetting that habits formed in business do not disappear at home, and with a few deliberate calls and authorizations that had been set up long before, the access she took for granted vanished, not with alarms or accusations but with simple denial. Screens that would not load, transfers that would not process, balances she could no longer touch, and I knew the shock would not register immediately, that it would hit her later, in the quiet of the morning when excuses are harder to invent and panic has room to breathe, because there is something uniquely unsettling about realizing control has been removed without warning, without confrontation, without a chance to argue or manipulate the narrative, and while she would be scrambling to understand what happened, I was already moving to the part she assumed I would never dare challenge, the custody arrangements, the one area she believed I was too sentimental, too tired, too trusting to touch, not knowing that for over a year I had been collecting documentation, not out of malice but out of prudence, records of conversations, patterns of behavior, agreements quietly altered without my consent, all gathered patiently, stored carefully, because truth has a way of becoming powerful when it is organized, and I had allies too, people she believed were firmly in her corner simply because she spoke louder or more confidently, not understanding that loyalty is rarely blind when facts are presented clearly and without emotion, and as dawn approached, as the night slowly gave way to that pale early light that makes everything look softer and more exposed, every piece she thought she controlled had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but decisively, and there is a particular kind of power in knowing that the outcome has already been determined while the other person still believes they are in the middle of the game, because she would wake up expecting leverage and find none, expecting access and be denied, expecting control and meet silence, and I could imagine the confusion setting in, the disbelief, the frantic mental replay of recent conversations searching for a clue she had missed, never realizing that the clue was not a word or an argument but my calm, my silence, my refusal to react the way she expected, and as I sat there, watching the sky lighten and the world slowly resume its normal rhythm, I felt no urge to gloat, no rush of triumph, only a deep sense of certainty, because justice, when executed quietly, does not announce itself, it settles in, it changes the shape of things, it leaves no room for debate. And in that moment I understood that the most devastating moves are often the ones no one sees coming, the ones that happen without raised voices or slammed doors, the ones carried out by someone who has accepted the truth, made peace with it, and chosen to act with precision rather than impulse. And as the final pieces fell into place, as every advantage she believed she held dissolved without a single confrontation, I realized that this was my moment, not a moment of anger or revenge, but a moment of balance being restored, where the chaos she tried to create met the structure I had built quietly over time, and there is a strange calm that comes with that realization, a calm that does not need validation or acknowledgement, because it exists entirely within the knowledge that what has been done cannot be undone, that the storm has already passed for the one who prepared, and that the silence left behind is not emptiness but resolution, firm, absolute, and unshakable. I stayed in the car long after the night had begun to fade, the darkness giving way to that fragile moment just before sunrise, when the world holds its breath and everything looks softer, edges blurred by early light, and I sipped the cold coffee I had long forgotten, the bitter warmth, the grounding ritual as I watched the first rays creep across the rooftops, brush the leaves of the trees, and spill across the quiet neighborhood that had no idea what had already happened inside my house. And as I waited, I thought about how carefully she had constructed her perception of control, how she had assumed I was reactive, impulsive, perhaps too slow to notice or act, and yet here I was, calm, patient, a silent observer to the culmination of months of careful preparation, and she returned home later than usual, probably expecting me gone, expecting confusion, confrontation, perhaps a fight, something dramatic, something that would let her feel powerful and clever, but instead, she walked into a house that was silent, stripped of any leverage she believed she held, the kind of silence that carries weight, that presses on the mind and makes you notice every detail, every absence, every shift in reality she had not anticipated, and as she stepped across the threshold, I could see her immediately register the unfamiliar quiet, the way the papers lay scattered across the table, signed, filed, finalized in ways she couldn't undo, the accounts she thought she controlled frozen, inaccessible, deactivated, the keys that gave her access now meaningless, the custody papers placed carefully but unmistakably in her view, legal and absolute, and in that instant, every carefully constructed illusion of dominance she had cultivated over months, years even, began to unravel before her eyes, and I could watch it happen, every flicker of emotion crossing her face, the whitening of the eyes, the slight gasp as her lips parted, the way her hands moved almost unconsciously as if trying to grasp reality itself, the immediate tightening in her posture, that subtle but unmistakable tension in her shoulders, the way her entire body seemed to freeze for just a fraction of a second as her brain scrambled to reconcile what she saw with the story she had been telling herself, and I could feel the shift in her energy, that unmistakable change from confidence to doubt, from dominance to panic, disbelief, and then a creeping sense of fear, because she had wielded manipulation as a weapon for so long, twisting circumstances, bending narratives, hiding her moves in layers of subtle deceit, and now, for the first time, she was facing a reality where those tools no longer worked, where every advantage she thought she had was gone, where the chessboard she had assumed was set entirely in her favor had been quietly, invisibly, rearranged by a hand she never expected to move, and I could almost hear the thoughts running through her mind, racing, jumbled, desperate. What happened? How did this happen? Why can't I access the accounts? Why are these papers here? Who authorized this? How could he have known? She tried to speak, to articulate some explanation, some deflection, some accusation, but the words failed her, caught in a throat suddenly tight with confusion and disbelief, and I noticed how she looked at every detail as if each one could offer a clue, a loophole, a way to regain what she had lost, but there was none, because every step had been calculated, anticipated, executed with precision, and in that moment, I felt no gloating, no rush of triumph that often comes with vindication. Because I understood that the true power of justice, the kind that changes the game without spectacle, does not need to be celebrated, it does not need fanfare, it does not require shouting or confrontation, it is absolute and quiet, felt in the way reality shifts and people are forced to acknowledge the consequences of their own actions. And as I watched her, frozen in that doorway, a woman who had always wielded the tools of control effortlessly, now reduced to confusion and helplessness, I realized that patience had been my greatest ally, that silence had been my weapon, that the months of careful observation, the quiet preparation, the small unnoticed steps I had taken, were all culminating in this precise, devastating moment, and it was not anger that guided me, it was clarity, a clarity that allowed me to anticipate not only her reaction but the exact sequence of emotions that would unfold as she faced the truth, as she realized that every assumption she had made about my passivity was false, that every confidence she had built on the idea that I would not notice, would not act, had been misplaced, and that certainty, that deliberate, unshakable knowledge that she had never truly had control, filled me with a satisfaction that was not cruel but just, because the balance had been restored quietly, perfectly, with no spectacle, no unnecessary drama, just the undeniable reality of consequence. And as I sat there in the soft light of morning, watching the confusion ripple across her face, I understood in a way I never had before that power lies not in volume or force, but in foresight and execution, in the patience to wait for the perfect alignment of conditions, and in knowing that when the moment comes, it strikes like a hammer, absolute, unstoppable. And as the sun rose, spilling light over the scene, I realized that in that perfect silence, the lesson had been delivered, the scales had shifted, and the quiet execution of my plan had achieved something far more satisfying than confrontation ever could, because she had assumed I was powerless, she had assumed that my patience was weakness, she had assumed that silence was surrender, and now she was left to confront a reality she had never anticipated, and I sat back in the car, hands relaxed on the steering wheel, coffee long cold, breathing slowly, absorbing the satisfaction of a long-prepared truth finally revealed, knowing that everything she had relied on to manipulate and control had been removed, not with chaos, not with anger, not with noise, but with the quiet, deliberate, and absolute execution of a plan that had been building long before she ever thought to challenge it. And in that calm, watching her struggle to process, I understood that sometimes the most devastating moves are not the loudest, not the most visible, but the ones that unfold quietly, invisibly, and inevitably, leaving the person who believed they were empowered to realize, too late, that they had never truly had any control at all. She finally found her voice, though it was smaller, tremulous, stripped of the usual sharpness and confidence she wielded like a weapon for years, and when she whispered, almost choking on the disbelief that had overtaken her, "Richard, what happened? Where's everything?" It was the first crack in the armor she had so carefully worn for decades, the first sign that the carefully constructed world she believed she controlled was unraveling before her very eyes, and I sat there calmly, hands wrapped around the now lukewarm coffee, taking slow, deliberate sips, breathing evenly, because I understood something she never did. That silence speaks far louder than words when the truth is already evident in every detail, and she expected, without doubt, some torrent of rage, some flood of accusations, a speech that would allow her to twist reality into her narrative one last time. But I gave her none of that, because the conversation she thought we were about to have had already taken place, long before her realization, in the movements I had made while she slept, in the documents she hadn't noticed, in the subtle shifts in assets and access that she assumed she controlled but could no longer reach, and as she looked around the kitchen, her eyes scanning the empty safe that once held her confidence, the neat piles of signed and filed documents that removed every shred of her assumed authority, the frozen screens of bank accounts she believed were untouchable, the custody papers that had been quietly delivered into legal effect, every item she believed would keep me powerless now screamed a truth she had refused to see, and in that silence, a silence heavier than any argument, the weight of her own actions began to settle upon her, a slow, almost painful realization that she had spent years manipulating, lying, and controlling, and every one of those moves, every carefully executed betrayal, had consequences, consequences she had wielded like a weapon against me, only now turning back with perfect, quiet precision, and I could see it in her eyes, that widening, that subtle shift from panic to disbelief, the realization that the world she thought she orchestrated was now operating according to rules she had ignored. That control was no longer hers, and she had no words to bridge the chasm between her expectations and reality, because reality doesn't negotiate, it simply exists, and the truth of her overreach, the culmination of her assumptions and manipulations, could not be argued away with excuses or sharp words. It could only be seen, internalized, and confronted, and she realized that while she had been counting on my silence to remain compliant, my patience had been my weapon, my observation had been my strategy, and every careful, invisible move I had made in the background had prepared for this exact moment, and as she shifted from one evidence to the next, her gaze darting frantically, as if scanning the room would reveal a loophole or a backdoor she had missed, her mind must have been spinning with questions too large to answer, trying to make sense of a system she had never truly understood, a network of preparation and foresight that she had believed was absent in me, and I could feel her panic rising, the shallow breaths, the whitening pupils, the hands clutching at counters and edges as if holding onto something physical could help her comprehend the impossibility she faced, and yet I said nothing, because words were redundant, superfluous, incapable of enhancing the message already laid bare by action, by fact, by the quiet, deliberate orchestration of every step, every contingency, every move she never anticipated, and there was something profoundly satisfying in that stillness, not because I wanted to inflict suffering or revel in her defeat, but because the truth has a clarity and finality that argument cannot match, and in that silence, she experienced it in its rawest, most unrelenting form, the understanding that betrayal, manipulation, and the illusion of control all carry consequences, consequences she had believed she could dodge, manipulate, or rewrite, and I watched as comprehension dawned slowly, painfully, the cognitive shift where one realizes the ground has moved beneath them, and there is nothing left to grab for stability except acknowledgement of the inevitable, and she struggled, quietly, muttering names, dates, excuses under her breath, words that had no power now, because the narrative had already been rewritten without ceremony or drama, with only deliberate care and strategy, and in that moment, I understood the difference between justice delivered loudly and justice delivered methodically, because the loud delivery allows for rebuttal, allows for chaos, allows the emotional storm to distract from the reality, whereas quiet, invisible precision leaves only the stark clarity of fact, and I could see it in her expression, the disbelief, the terror, the fleeting attempt to regain composure, the frantic hope that she had overlooked something, some loophole, some error, but there was none, because every piece had been anticipated, every angle covered, every anticipated reaction accounted for, and I realized that this was far more effective than confrontation, because while a fight might have ended in anger, while words could have allowed her to manipulate, to deflect, to distract, the silence stripped her of all those options, leaving only the awareness of the consequences of her own making, and as the moments stretched into minutes, her desperation grew quieter, the frantic energy replaced by stunned paralysis, because she had believed she could provoke chaos, and instead she met an unshakable calm, a measured force that did not need to argue, to yell, or to prove a point, because the evidence spoke for itself, louder and clearer than any speech ever could, and in that calm, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity myself, the kind that comes from years of observing, enduring, and planning, a calm that no betrayal, no deception, no manipulation could penetrate, a calm born from knowing that everything had been accounted for, every move anticipated, every consequence orchestrated, and in that moment, she finally realized that the life she had thought she controlled, the leverage she had believed she possessed, the manipulation she had assumed was invisible, was all gone, vanished not with violence but with quiet, precise execution, and the lesson settled over her like a weight she could not lift, the lesson that actions, no matter how subtle or hidden, always return to their origin, and that power built on deceit and fear is fragile, easily undone when the other party chooses. Patience over panic, observation over reaction, planning over impulse, and as she stood there, frozen in the space that once gave her dominance, I understood fully the profound impact of silence, of waiting, of letting actions speak without commentary, because in that silence, she confronted not just the reality of what had happened, but the truth about who I was, a man who may have endured quietly, may have appeared compliant, may have seemed unassuming, but who had never surrendered control. And in that stillness, the finality of her situation crystallized, the impossibility of reversing any of it becoming undeniable, and I realized that sometimes, the most effective conversations are the ones that never happen, the ones where words are unnecessary, where actions, preparation, and quiet patience speak louder than any argument, louder than any scream, louder than any pleading. And as she finally lowered her gaze, realizing the full scope of the shift, the irrevocable nature of what she had triggered, the world around her had already changed without fanfare, without spectacle, without a single word exchanged, and it was in that moment, watching her confusion and disbelief settle, that I felt not vengeance but resolution, a quiet, absolute understanding that truth and preparation had triumphed, and that the consequences she had never imagined were now unavoidable, and the conversation that might have erupted with accusations, protests, and drama was rendered completely unnecessary, because every answer she sought, every explanation she hoped to conjure, had already been delivered silently, invisibly, unassailably, through every decision, every document, every move she had overlooked, and in that heavy, undeniable silence, I saw the profound impact of a life lived patiently, strategically, and with unshakable clarity, and I understood, more deeply than ever, that sometimes, the world changes not because of words shouted or doors slammed, but because someone finally stops reacting and begins acting with quiet, unstoppable precision. Later that day, after she had stormed out of the house in a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and barely restrained fury, leaving behind a trail of silent tension that hung in the air like a thick fog, I found myself alone in the kitchen that had once been the center of our shared life, the place where mornings were casual, conversations flowed freely, coffee cups sat in pairs, and laughter, sometimes quiet, sometimes forced, had filled the space without thought of manipulation or strategy, and as I sat there, feeling the weight of silence settle over me, I reflected deeply on the events of the past hours and the decisions that had led to this moment, because this was not a night defined by petty revenge or vindictive gloating, not by the kind of angry confrontation that television dramas make so entertaining, but by something far quieter, far more profound, reclamation, the reclamation of control that had been eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly, over years of subtle manipulation, the reclamation of dignity from someone who had assumed she could bend reality to her will simply because I trusted, simply because I endured, simply because I valued patience and loyalty over spectacle, and I thought about the years we had shared, the compromises I had made, the quiet sacrifices I had absorbed without fanfare, the times I had swallowed my doubts, ignored small inconsistencies, believed explanations that were convenient to her but uncomfortable to me, all in the name of maintaining peace, and I realized in that quiet, sunlit kitchen that none of it had been wasted, because every record I had kept, every note I had made, every observation that seemed trivial at the time, every phone call I had silently monitored, every hesitation I had recorded in my mind, every small instinct I had acted upon without revealing it, all of it had built toward this precise moment where action, calm, and preparation intersected perfectly, and I understood for the first time the immense power of patient observation and deliberate planning, the kind of power that does not scream or demand attention but works invisibly, steadily, inevitably, and as I sat alone, allowing myself to feel the weight and the meaning of what had transpired, I realized that what I had done was not simply to reclaim material possessions or enforce legal authority, although those were part of it, but to reclaim the narrative of my own life, to take back the control over my circumstances that she had assumed. She could dominate, to assert without aggression that my choices mattered, that my foresight mattered, that my patience and intellect mattered, and in that understanding, I felt a profound, almost unshakable sense of clarity, because the lesson was not in the defeat of another, not in the temporary shock or panic she experienced, but in the knowledge that life rewards preparation, that consequences exist not because of fury but because of deliberate, intelligent action. And I thought about fairness, or the lack of it, because life rarely offers it voluntarily, it rarely hands it over neatly packaged, and yet, preparation creates its own kind of fairness, the kind that allows a man to meet betrayal not with desperation but with calm, the kind that allows him to transform shock into strategy, the kind that allows him to act with dignity and precision in the face of deceit and manipulation. And I understood, perhaps more than I had in decades, that all of the late nights, the quiet reflections, the notes I took, the patterns I observed, the patience I forced myself to practice, were not burdens but tools, not wasted effort but invisible investments, all of which had finally paid off in a single, decisive moment where control, dignity, and justice converged quietly and completely. And as I sipped the now cold coffee, feeling the sunlight on my hands and the quiet air of the kitchen around me, I allowed myself to acknowledge a subtle but profound satisfaction, not the kind born of cruelty or spite, but the kind born of understanding that careful, patient, deliberate action creates outcomes that are absolute, irreversible, and just. And in that reflection, I understood a fundamental truth: life will not always be fair, it will not always bend toward your favor, it will throw betrayals, lies, and manipulations at you without warning. But if you pay attention, if you prepare, if you quietly gather knowledge, keep records, observe patterns, and act with intention, then even the most shocking betrayals can be met with calm, handled with dignity, and ultimately transformed into justice. And that day, sitting alone in a kitchen that had witnessed both warmth and deceit, I understood the quiet, potent satisfaction that comes not from revenge, not from spectacle, but from a life lived with awareness, patience, and foresight. And as I leaned back in the chair, letting the sunlight warm the ache of the past away, I felt the first true sense of freedom in years. The freedom that comes from knowing you have acted rightly, decisively, and without compromise to your own principles. The freedom that comes from reclaiming control not through shouting or anger but through preparation, intelligence, and the quiet, unstoppable execution of a plan built carefully over time. And in that moment, I realized that this was more than a personal victory. It was a life lesson, a confirmation that patience, observation, and deliberate action always matter, that calm in the face of chaos is more powerful than fury, that the mind, when trained to notice, to calculate, to plan, is the most formidable weapon a person can wield, and that even when betrayal is profound and unexpected, it is never insurmountable if met with foresight. And as I sat there, alone with the sunlight streaming across the counters, the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside, and the echo of what had transpired, I felt a deep, unwavering sense of completion, of rightness, of a justice delivered not for show but for truth. And I understood finally that the calm, the patience, the quiet observation I had exercised all these years had not only protected me, they had allowed me to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my understanding of what it truly means to meet betrayal with quiet, unshakable strength. And as I sat there, drinking the last of my bitter coffee, I realized that nothing she could have done, nothing she could say, would change the fact that every step had been deliberate, every action measured, and every consequence earned. And that knowledge, that clarity, that absolute understanding of what I had done and why, was a triumph more profound than any shout, any accusation, any emotional confrontation could ever have achieved, because in the end, justice, preparation, and dignity always speak louder than words. And in that quiet, sunlit kitchen, I finally understood the full weight and beauty of what had been accomplished, the quiet, unstoppable force of patience meeting betrayal and transforming it into irrevocable clarity, control, and justice. Looking back on that night, and on the long series of events that had led to it, I realized the experience had taught me lessons that no confrontation, no shouting match, no public display of anger could ever have imparted, lessons carved not into a fleeting moment of emotion but into the bedrock of understanding that comes only from observing, waiting, and acting with patience and purpose. Because in life, people consistently underestimate the quiet ones, those who listen more than they speak, who watch more than they react, who take in the details of actions, words, gestures, and choices without making a scene. And in underestimating them, they lay the groundwork for their own undoing. And I had seen it firsthand, how she, confident, assertive, cunning even, had assumed that my silence was weakness, that my patience was submission, that my willingness to compromise and endure meant I lacked awareness or foresight. And it was exactly that assumption that became her undoing, because the quiet mind, the steady hand, the patient heart, when combined with preparation, is capable of shaping outcomes more decisively than any outburst, any dramatic confrontation, any storm of words or accusations, and that understanding changed the way I thought about power, control, and strength, because true strength is often invisible, often unrecognized, often ignored until it is too late, and I realized that the actions I had taken, the careful planning of legal moves, the securing of assets, the meticulous organization of evidence and documentation, the quiet coordination with trusted allies, the patience to wait for the perfect moment, had been exercises in a strength that many fail to see, one that does not shout, does not demand recognition, does not seek approval or applause, and in that strength lies a power that is absolute, unstoppable, and final, because it operates on reality, not perception, on preparation, not impulsive emotion, and it exposes the true nature of those who assume advantage through manipulation, deceit, or arrogance, and I thought about trust, that fragile, precious thing we give to those closest to us, and how easily it can be fractured, bent, and broken, and how devastating betrayal can feel when it comes from someone who has lived alongside you for years, who has shared in your life, your hopes, your responsibilities, your vulnerabilities, and yet even in the face of that betrayal, I realized that the pain, as sharp as it was, could be transformed into clarity, into strategy, into action that restores balance rather than escalating chaos, and I understood that revenge, when driven by reason rather than emotion, is not about destruction, is not about spectacle, is not about inflicting suffering for the sake of satisfaction, but about correction, about restoration, about realignment of what has been disrupted, about sending a message so clear and precise that those who underestimated you are forced to recognize the consequences of their actions, and that type of measured, deliberate response carries far more weight than any screaming argument, any accusation, any public humiliation, because it is rooted in fact, in preparation, in the quiet certainty of someone who has thought ahead, anticipated reactions, and executed without the need for validation. And I realized too that dignity is not something that comes from force, from noise, from the ability to dominate a room or a conversation, but from knowing the right steps to take, from taking them at the precise moment, from acting with intention and foresight when no one expects it, when the stage is set perfectly and every outcome is accounted for, and in that quiet, deliberate execution, dignity speaks louder than any words ever could, because it demonstrates mastery over circumstance rather than over others, and that mastery carries with it an unshakable confidence, a power that is respected without requiring spectacle, and I understood that silence is not absence, it is not surrender, it is not ignorance, silence is strategy, patience is power, observation is armor, and preparation is the sharpest weapon a person can wield, because it allows you to respond to betrayal, deception, and manipulation not with panic, not with emotion, but with calculated precision that leaves no room for doubt, no opportunity for manipulation, and no question about the inevitability of the outcome. And in reflecting on all of this, I saw that every decision I had made leading up to that morning, the careful documentation, the meticulous tracking, the quiet planning, the restraint from reactive emotion, the choice to observe rather than confront prematurely, had been an investment in the moment when justice could be delivered flawlessly, when balance could be restored without spectacle, when clarity could prevail over chaos, and it taught me a fundamental truth about life that I will carry forever. The loudest voices are rarely the strongest, the most visible actions are rarely the most effective, and those who build quietly, patiently, deliberately, often wield the deepest power, because while others are distracted by noise, emotion, and appearances, the quiet, observant, and prepared mind is already steps ahead, shaping outcomes, protecting what matters, and delivering consequences with precision and inevitability. And in understanding this, I also realized that personal power is intertwined with responsibility, that the same preparation that allows you to protect yourself allows you to act ethically and decisively, that strength without foresight is fleeting, but strength with patience and planning is enduring, and that when betrayal strikes, as it inevitably will in life, it can be met not with chaos or impulsive retaliation but with the calm, deliberate application of knowledge, strategy, and awareness. And I finally understood that the lessons of that morning were larger than just my personal experience. They were lessons about human behavior, about the underestimated power of observation, about the consequences of arrogance, about the value of patience, and about the enduring force of quiet, calculated action. And as I sat there in the sunlit kitchen, the house now silent and empty, the reality of what had been accomplished settling over me like a quiet wave, I felt a profound sense of clarity, of satisfaction, of mastery, because I had learned, in the most tangible way possible, that real strength is not measured in noise, not in confrontation, not in chaos, but in silence, patience, and the unshakable ability to act decisively when the moment is right. And that is a power that no one can take from you, that no one can anticipate, and that, ultimately, defines not only the outcomes of conflict but the very character of the person wielding it. Weeks had passed since that quiet morning when the full weight of what I had meticulously prepared finally revealed itself, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost foreign after the chaos, the tension, and the silent battles that had preceded it. Yet in that rhythm, I discovered a new sense of clarity and strength I hadn't known I possessed, because the house, once a stage for manipulation and subtle power plays, now stood secure, every corner a testament to foresight and deliberate action. The property, the shared financial accounts, the custody arrangements, all reorganized, aligned, and stabilized in ways that ensured no one could ever wield the leverage they had assumed was theirs. And she had learned a lesson as harsh as it was unavoidable, a lesson in underestimating patience, quiet observation, and the power of preparation, a lesson I observed without malice or gloating, because there is no satisfaction in watching someone suffer when the true satisfaction lies in knowing the lesson has been internalized, and in watching the world continue to move, unbent by anger or spectacle. I felt no need for celebration or vindictive triumph, because what mattered was not the temporary shock of her realization but the enduring clarity of my own position, my regained control, my restored dignity, and the peace of mind that had been absent for far too long. And in that stillness, I reflected on the nature of power and strength, realizing that they are rarely defined by loud confrontations, by dramatic gestures, or by the impulsive release of emotion, but by the quiet, careful, and strategic decisions made when no one is watching, by the preparation for possibilities that others dismiss or ignore, by the patience to wait for the perfect moment when action will be most effective and irrevocable. And I understood finally that betrayal, as painful as it may be, is often a teacher disguised in disguise, forcing awareness, forcing strategy, forcing a kind of patience that builds unshakable resilience, because those who act with foresight and deliberate intent do not merely recover what is lost, they surpass it, reclaiming not just material assets but respect, control, and, most importantly, inner peace. And I saw clearly that the world does not actively punish those who do wrong, it merely allows consequences to unfold, and those who are ready, observant, and decisive are the ones who benefit from the natural order, the inevitable justice of careful preparation. And in embracing that truth, I felt a profound transformation, a strength rooted not in anger or the desire to retaliate but in the knowledge that calm, calculated action delivers outcomes that rage never could. And as I moved forward in those weeks, every choice I made was infused with that wisdom, patience over impulse, strategy over reaction, foresight over assumption, and in every interaction, every decision, I felt the unshakable confidence of a man who had been tested, who had endured, and who had acted not out of emotion but out of precision. And in that confidence, I rebuilt a life not defined by fear, manipulation, or past betrayals, but by control, clarity, and the understanding that true victory is measured not by others' suffering, not by revenge or retribution, but by the quiet, unstoppable, and strategic reclaiming of what is yours and the maintenance of peace in the aftermath. And as I sit back in my home now, seeing the light spill over the same rooms that once felt like battlegrounds, I realize that strength lies in the ability to endure quietly, to observe intently, to prepare meticulously, and to act decisively, and that the most profound victories are those that unfold silently, irrevocably, and perfectly, leaving no space for doubt, no opportunity for manipulation, and no need for dramatics, because the measure of a man is revealed not in the noise he makes but in the control he quietly exerts over his life, his choices, and the consequences of those who underestimated him. And in that understanding, I finally found something far greater than revenge or restitution, a life moving forward stronger, calmer, wiser, and unshakably at peace, fully aware that preparation and patience are more powerful than anger, more effective than confrontation, and more enduring than fleeting satisfaction. And that true victory is the reclamation of your life in its entirety, the restoration of control, dignity, and respect, and the quiet knowledge that when the moment is right, a person who has observed, prepared, and waited will always emerge not only unscathed but triumphant, because the world favors those who act with precision, patience, and foresight, and nothing, no betrayal, no deception, no manipulation, can undo that when it has been earned through deliberate, quiet, and unstoppable strategy.